Welcome to everybody. It's good to be here with you. I'm Father Tim Holida. I'm with the Co-Cathedral of St. Thomas More. You may have read about us in the news this summer. We had a little fire. We're doing okay. I'm on video apparently, so I'm going to have to clean up my language a little bit today. Not as much cussing, right? Let me just begin by letting everybody introduce themselves. I'm going to give Rabbi Shields a little more time just to tell us a little bit about who he is, but we'll start with.
Gary Schultz. I'm the senior pastor here at First Baptist, and so welcome. We are glad to host. This is my second year on the God Squad, and looking forward to another great year.
I am Derek McGee. I pastor a church called Bible-Based Church, and I've been blessed and fortunate to be on the forum all 10 seasons. And if you've been here, you know this was normally Jack Romberg's seat. And so since he's gone, I'm going to make this seat righteous again. I'm going to sit here.
Well, I'm Rabbi Michael Shields, and I think change could be a wonderful thing. And I really didn't know what seat Rabbi Romberg sat in. But just like every pastor is different, every rabbi is a little bit different. And so I really look forward to sharing this forum and learning with all of you. I came from Davidson, North Carolina, so go Wildcats. Lets you stay out of the North Carolina Duke debacle or war. And I have a 6-year-old son and a 3-year-old daughter who are responsible if anything I say seems disjointed or doesn't make sense. It's their fault. But I'm happy to be here.
Well, we're happy to have you here too. So today we're kind of building off of the theme that's been established for the whole season, this year's season with the Village Square, which is the year of living locally. And I think what they're attempting to do, and we're participating in that, is perhaps, the question is perhaps maybe we're looking a little bit too much at the national news. And people are angry and people are upset and so on. And this has been going on for a long time. We see that poll numbers reflect that people think that the country's headed in the wrong direction. That's been going on for longer than the current presidency. It's been going on for quite some time. It seems that people are very anxious and angry and upset over different things that are happening in the national news. We're polarized, we're divided as a country, as a community. And so the idea is maybe we need to look locally a little bit more. Maybe we need to look at what we can actually accomplish. I know for myself, you've heard me speak about this multiple times when we have these gatherings. I'm able to affect what happens in Washington by voting once every 2 to 4 years, right? And 1 out of millions of votes. And not that that's not important, of course it is, but I feel like I affect a lot of people every day right here in Tallahassee, and so do you, right? You affect and interact with people in Tallahassee right here. And so thinking about these things, thinking about local politics, local community, local organizations and so on, and turning our attention more to that a little bit this season rather than what's being played out on the news and the news media. And so part of the theme today is subsidiarity, which Liz has said I guess it is a Catholic principle. I think it exists in different forms, but in Catholic social teaching, the idea of subsidiarity is that problems are often handled best at a local level, at the people closest to the problem, and that they should be handled in that way as long as that's the best way to handle them, right? A very simple idea. And we see that, we try to be committed to that even in our church. In a way, we govern our church. So we all know that we have a centralized authority in the Catholic Church, the man in white, the Pope Francis in Rome, and he is, for us, the supreme authority. But he doesn't tell me what to do, doesn't tell me where to go, where to be assigned or anything like that. I guess he could if he wanted to, but that would be strange, right? Instead, we have a bishop, right? A bishop that kind of is our pastor over this diocese, this region, and then individual parishes that have a little bit of autonomy themselves. So the bishop can move me basically at whim, but he can't tell our pastors how to spend their money or tell them what to do. So if someone left the church, a parish locally, a bunch of money in their estate. The bishop can't say, you know what, I want that money, bring it to me, I'm going to do this or that with it. The pastor has a responsibility to those people and to that local thing. So the idea, again, being there's certain things we need to reserve to a larger organization, whether it's in Rome or the United States Conference of Bishops, and to the bishop himself, but often try to look to solutions at a local level. And so that's at least kind of how it gets played out in the governance in our church. And I wanted to ask the guys here we'll start with this question. Just kind of what does subsidiarity look like for you, or how does church governance look like for you in your individual congregations or religions?
So for our church, we are a church plant 9 years ago, August 8, 2010. Our church is ran by a board of elders, but we are, from a black congregational standpoint, we are the closest thing to a congregational church that you would find in the black Baptist church or black denominational church, in that our parishioners have a lot of say-so, but a board of elders governs our church, and then I have the authority to basically handle the day-to-day operations of it all. And even as the church planter, that's how we did our bylaws and our constitutions. Overall, the supreme deity of all is Jesus Christ, and so we try to make sure that the Bible governs what we do, but that's how our church is ran.
So I'll take the governance piece first and then a little bit on subsidiarity. Governance, currently there's an interesting conversation going on between generations in the Reform movement of Judaism, which is theologically the most progressive. Generally, every synagogue is thought of as its own entity. We're part of a movement, but even the rulings of the movement, we're not necessarily bound by them. So each rabbi has local authority. The younger generation, of which I am a part, generally says, well, if we're not bound by anything, first of all, that's not very Jewish because of the whole system of commandments. Second of all, how do we have integrity, right? So if, as Reform Jews, people who are in traditional Judaism and really Judaism in general, there is a sense of commandedness and a sense of vigorous debate and discussion with usually a conclusion at the end, then how do we all have different rules? And shouldn't we, with a sense of humility, if there's a central body, which we do have, that answers questions of law and practice and whatever else, if they issue a ruling, shouldn't we feel bound by it? Because it would take a lot of chutzpah, right? For me as a 40-year-old rabbi to say, well, these 15 people, they're some of the smartest scholars, rabbis in the entire Jewish world. I'm just going to do whatever I want, though. And so I think right now there's a conversation about how do we reestablish within the progressive theological window a sense of Jewish law and boundedness, being bound by that Jewish law, but with progressive sensibility. And so for me, the hierarchical, I'm actually looking for a little bit more hierarchy and a little more adherence to tradition and law. From a sense of subsidiarity, I've been studying a lot on subsidiarity and reading a lot of couple of the Pope's thoughts on this. But the common thing that's out there is that subsidiarity has to do with government. And it does not really have to do solely with government. And it is definitely not local is always better no matter what. And it definitely has nothing to say about free market economy. I mean, not nothing, but it's not saying free market, that's what rules it. No, what rules subsidiarity is the common good. And you have these intermediary organizations who scale to size, right? So even some of the popes called for global governance, right? Just this morning, people were rallying close by about climate change. Well, guess what? A local solution, that's what the big corporations want. They want us to be focused on plastic straws, getting rid of them, instead of the 3 or 4 big corporate entities that are essentially the autocratic rulers of an actual not free market economy, because it doesn't free anybody and it's not really a fair market. And so I think it's important to recognize that subsidiarity is not, and I'll pick on him because he's no longer in office, what Paul Ryan claimed when he suggested his budget, that this is a spiritual principle that I'm living by in my budget. It was not. It was driven by something else. And I think that's true of Democrats and Republicans. They're not driven, they're driven by ideology, but not this concept of subsidiarity really in any way. And for me, that's a really important distinction.
And to take a look at both of those questions, as Baptists, we believe in congregational authority, which means that the congregation itself is the authority because we report directly to Jesus Christ. We believe that every church has Jesus as its head, and therefore every church is accountable to follow Jesus, and that Jesus calls on us to follow him by following his word in the power of his Holy Spirit, and that each member of the church is responsible to do that. And so as a pastor, I'm invested with leadership to help guide the congregation and to help to equip the congregation to do that, and yet I am accountable to the congregation as a whole. And so when it comes to the principles of subsidiarity, as we're talking about localism, that obviously fits in very well with what we believe about what the church is. And in fact, one of the things that intrigues me most about this principle is the idea of the church being out front, developing that community, bringing people together, helping people to take care of their community themselves. Because, of course, as the church, we don't just live for ourselves. We are put here by God to impact our community for Jesus Christ. Part of that is based on a biblical principle that as Baptists we hold very dear called the priesthood of believers. And that, again, every believer is a priest before God, which means that every believer comes to God on their own through Jesus Christ, is accountable to do that, and then that every believer is accountable to go out and live for Jesus Christ. And so we believe that every person in the church has an equal amount of authority, if we're using those kind of terms, but an equal responsibility to live out their faith together.
Thank you. I want to ask you guys have you experienced, at least what we're kind of responding to at the Village Square, this kind of nationalization of the politics, the divisiveness, the polarization, the kind of negativity I think that we're all experiencing. Have you experienced that as a clergy person? Have you seen that in your congregations?
I'll go first. So yes, I have, and I think one of it because we're in a world now where we're consumed by 24-hour media and by social media, more in particular, especially in my realm of ministry, where now I have congregants who don't even carry a Bible anymore. Everything is now on their devices, and they swear to me they're looking at their Bible while I'm up preaching. I fail to believe any of that being true whatsoever. But I think in that regard, absolutely. And I've always said this as a guy who works in politics, as a pastor, that national politics irritates me, but local politics affect me. And I really believe that. But I think what happens is that we are so focused on every movement on the national scale that all of a sudden it becomes consuming to the lifespan, the lifestyle of individuals. We're so worried about the things that are going on. For the most part, some people have no real knowledge of what's being said out of D.C. Is just concerned by it. If you watch CNN, Fox News, MSNBC, they're all competing with each other on the most deplorable stories, and every story really is about how bad it's going to get and how bad it is. And so if you listen to that all day, every day, that becomes your narrative on life. And I have congregants who all day I'll say, I would say, it's good to see you. Is it really good to see me? I'm not sure you're going to see me again, because they're so consumed by everything that's going on. I think also because of that, and I'm not one who's ignorant to the challenges of race, but I also think when you start looking at it from a national scale of the bickering that goes on between races, we take what we see nationally and then we make that our local issue, where now I'm looking at you totally different because of how I see things. And so the hardest thing in this world of 24-hour media, especially social media, I sound like Tim talking about social media like this, but is that everybody is consumed by the ready-made responses, and so now it's that consuming. And it's challenging from a clergy perspective because once somebody says it, people believe that is now the truth. And so I spend more time trying to unravel. There's no truth to that whatsoever. That one person did a report doesn't mean that that's actually the accurate report. There's a lot more that goes on. There was life before this. Real quick story, I have a millennial in my office, and I was talking to her about something. I said, I don't know if you realize it, but before there were cell phones, there were landline phones. And she gave me this blank look. I said, during hurricane seasons, you need to have a landline phone. And she had no idea what I was talking about, because her world is cell phone and beyond. Never seen a typewriter or anything like that, because in her mind, nothing pre-existed her being here. I bring it up to you because in what goes on as a pastor, their belief is that what they're seeing now is accurate, and so now they consume themselves in that reflection.
No, I agree with just about everything that Derek said. It can be difficult. You know, one of the things that I think the church ought to do is to bring people together who believe different things about how this world should be governed, who have different political opinions, who have different backgrounds, who have different experiences, and bring them together around the gospel of Jesus Christ. That is, that we should not be seen as wedded to the policies of the Republican Party or the Democratic Party, but we should be able to come together and worship our Savior and dialogue and have conversations about what our faith should look like, how we should live out our faith. And in a healthy church, that takes place. I love seeing people that I know who, one person's a Republican, one person's a Democrat, and they're actually having a civil conversation about an issue that they disagree about. And they should, because they're brothers and sisters in Christ, and they recognize that. But it's easy in our world that is so polarized, that is, if we got to be, and I'll bring up the social media thing. I do think we have to be disciplined about how often we're on things like Twitter or Facebook, because it's very easy to get this sense that everybody is on this extreme or this extreme, and these two extremes can never meet, can never dialogue, and there's so much vitriol there. But when you put people face to face, when you unite people, when you bring them together, when you help them to understand that there's more to this life than just what we can see, than just what's immediate and in front of us, transformation takes place. And so what I have found is, while yes, there are exceptions, and sometimes those conversations can go off the rails and have to step in, and sometimes you have to be careful about how you nuance this or that, in general, those conversations have been much better, more cordial. There's been more listening that takes place in the context of the local congregation. And I think in this world, that's one of the things that we as churches can really do and focus on in bringing people together. We might have to make an effort to do that, but it's a worthwhile effort.
So, Judaism is very this world focused. And so Judaism is very this world focused. The concepts of heaven and hell are much less defined. That's another class for another time. And even that concept of, yes, there's a concept of heaven, but there's a story that says if you're planting a tree or treating a leper on the side of the road and you see the Messiah coming, what should you do? Should you go out and greet the Messiah, or should you finish planting the tree, treating the leper? And the answer is finish planting the tree. Partially because there have been, from a Jewish perspective, a number of false messiahs. And frankly, even Scripture identifies Cyrus of Persia arguably as Messiah, and we can all agree on this panel that that's not the case. So even Scripture can be wrong from a Jewish perspective, because from a progressive Jewish perspective, it's written down in a certain time and place by men. And that alone should tell half the people in this room that it could be wrong. So that's one aspect that I think is really important to understand, what I would call the rabbinic mindset. The other piece is, I actually don't think, I use social media all the time, and I love it. Because 50 years ago, you could only run into people in the coffee shop. You could only tap them on the shoulder if you actually ran into them. But I think social media offers and the ability to tap people on the shoulder and open many more doors and windows into relationship than we've ever had before. And frankly, I think the idea of more ideas in the common marketplace, that's wonderful. I also think, and I really say this, if we don't start from a place of our faith, right? If I as a rabbi I decide this is my political position, and then I'm going to go find some Jewish stuff to justify it, then that's not the right way to go about it. But if I'm coming from a Jewish place, inspired by the prophetic tradition and the fullness of Jewish tradition, the fact that I come out on the same side that happens to be X party or Y party becomes less relevant, or at least it should. But that's not where we are. And frankly, the last couple years has been profoundly different than previous years. And I think people try to say, oh, no, it's the same partisanship playing out. Let's all just get along. No, sometimes you have to not get along. You have to be radically inhospitable to ideas that are considered unholy. And so the fact that some things are considered, well, it's my opinion. Well, just because you say it's my opinion doesn't mean it's right. And there are some real numbers out there when they can tabulate up the number of lies from some of our leaders. I get that there are mistruths by every politician, but check the stats. They have to point to something. So we are in a radically different time, and I have taken issue with various presidents, but this is a new time, and it's not a political statement. It is a justice statement for me. And so I think we have to not allow the localism, let's kind of kumbaya in our churches and synagogues, get in the way of fulfilling our prophetic duty towards justice. And that is something I think we lose in this. And what we do is we attack first to put someone else on the defensive so they won't possibly even bother to argue. And in Judaism, arguing is a beautiful thing.
So there's a lot I could say to that. Thank you. And I agree. I think we have to, as clergy, we can't shy away from our duties, even if it's a national landscape or a task or something. But an example I would give you just in what I've seen in my church is when Barack Obama was reelected president in 2012, I had parishioners call me and come and meet with me, and they were absolutely distraught. And this may be, for those of you on the left, that might be hard for you to understand. Just like for people on the right, it's hard for you to them to understand why people on the left feel the way they do. And we really have to get to a place, not of kumbaya, but of trusting that each of us want the good. And perhaps, that needs to be discussed. And we need to see each other's in the face, is what I believe, to have a really good, accurate discussion, not hiding behind a computer. But these people came to me, and I mean you, they were like in tears, like concerned and worried, and they were asking me, Father, what are we going to do? And I was like, it's going to be okay. And regardless of how I feel about President Trump or President Obama, this goes back to high school. I got involved and interested in politics back then. I wanted to start a club about it, and my principal told me, nothing really ever changes or something. And in some ways, I asked them, let's see what actually happens. And I can tell you this as a priest, this is my first 5 years as a priest during Obama's second term. If I did not watch the news, personally, in my experience as a human being where I live, in my reality, how did my life change? 0. In fact, I can't think of one thing. Now, that might be different for other people. Especially if you're, depending on your tax situation or social, and healthcare and so on, that might be different. But I'm just telling you, from my personal experience, nothing changed. Except, I'm not going to get into that. Health insurance did change for me, by the way, not in a good way. But I'm not blaming him. The same thing. President Trump got elected. People came to me. My parish is very diverse, and they came to me very upset. What are we going to do? What are we going to do? I said, I promise, I don't think your life's going to change that much. I don't think it is. And I ask you just to ponder that. If you didn't watch the news, and I'm not advocating not following the news. I'm not advocating that. Or not caring about what goes on when there's a shooting in El Paso. I'm not advocating that. But I think, too, we have to, right in our own backyard, there's things going on. And if we're spending 80% of our time worried about what's going on in the White House, I just question how effective are we being? How effective are we being? And I think that's kind of the point of what we're trying to get at is not so much that we shouldn't care about it or not so much that we shouldn't pay attention or say, but maybe we're spending too much time talking about that and letting them dominate us and us be their puppets rather than the other way around. I'd like to ask a question. As we're getting to half our time, we can maybe turn into questions. One question I wanted to ask to everybody was, what are practical things? We get up here often and we talk about these things. We gripe and complain, or we're happy and encouraging about other things. But like, what is a practical thing? Like, some of you, I know this. I see things like, do you remember 9/11 when that just happened? One thing I remember is sitting there watching the television for like 48 hours straight almost, so angry, right? And felt so hurt, and I wanted to do something. And I was in the Marines, but I still was like, here in Tallahassee in college. You know, I was a reservist, and I was like, I hope they call me. And I just wanted to do something. And a lot of people went out and gave blood and things like that and traveled. And there was a lot of volunteer work and things, but I wanted to do something. I think often what happens, we see things, we want to do something about it. And so what is a practical thing we can do right here in a community that can actually strengthen our community? Maybe not change the law, but strengthen our community, because I think we have to become this quote that, we have to become the change that we want to be in the world.
Well, I'll take that. I think as followers of Jesus Christ, we respond to things on both an individual and a systemic level. That is that what can we do as individuals? And that might look like reaching out to somebody that you don't know and bringing them into your home. That might be beginning a conversation with somebody who's different than you. Mobilizing people in your neighborhood. I mean, that's where those kind of things begin. Working in your small group or class at church to affect a particular ministry. And then there are larger systemic things, and that's again where I think a principle such as subsidiarity or the localism of ministry can really make a difference. How much can I really affect at a national level as opposed to a local level, where I get together from other people in our community, and if I'm concerned about an issue such as how we should use guns, or sexual abuse, or what policing should look like, where you might actually be able to bring together people and make a difference in your actual community. And we're called to do both of those things, to think through how our faith impacts in both of those areas. And so I think that's something that we should continually think about. What am I doing on an individual, relational level to live out my faith, to make a positive difference for Jesus Christ in light of his kingdom? What are we doing to help our community to begin to look like that? And we will begin. That's a great place to begin. What are we passionate about? What do we see that really concerns us? What is something that just really grabs a hold of us and we feel like we can use our gifts and our time and our talent to make a difference, and start there?
So there's a concept of tzedakah in Judaism that is essentially mandatory giving to the poor, at least in the Talmudic sense of the word. It's not necessarily just money, but it's generally so it is required of the giver. It's a ritual obligation, and it's meant to be something that the poor deserve as a right. It's a right of the poor. And that is one concept of giving that is obligatory, and in some sense that would be taxes, tithes to the church, although I think churches have a good thing going. They say 10%, but a lot of the things churches used to do now are done by civil government, but don't tell your pastors I said that. And don't give less, or they'll be mad at me. Then there's another section called Gimilut Chasadim, which are acts of loving kindness. And those are optional in some sense. They're considered not a ritual obligation, but that would be like providing a dowry to a bride who is indigent, is poor, and that doesn't happen so much today, but it's not required, but it's really nice and good, and we should do it. And it's not necessarily just money, and it's not just necessarily only to the poor, it's to anybody. And that sense of obligation, but also free will offering is very important, and I'm not, from a one of my things that I found most useful in my congregational work and my work with college students especially is to point out privilege. So if there was one thing that we could do in our communities is point out privilege, and that is both local, that's state, that's national, that's international. Because I have to tell you, if the people in the former Yugoslavia were a bit darker in shade, I'm pretty sure we wouldn't have intervened as quickly as a world community. Think about how much longer it took to intervene in Rwanda, for example. I think if you could apply that to many scenarios. And so I think that's really, really important, because unless you have a conversation about privilege, right? I have a neurosurgeon friend of mine, pulled over 14 times in a year. I've been pulled over twice in my life. He's not a bad driver. So, and I know that doesn't seem spiritual, it doesn't seem, but for me that's a huge part of the conversation. It speaks to subsidiarity, it speaks to everything that we do. Because privilege, the corporate privilege, is destroying all of those intermediary organizations that are essential. So for me, it's all intertwined, but that's kind of a general comment. I welcome probing questions until the clock expires.
So for me, I'll be quick. I wrote down 3 things. First thing is turn off the TV and talk. You know, that used to work back then. You talk to people and you learned a lot. Secondly is something I challenge my congregation is dare to be uncomfortable. Yeah. That means put yourself in scenarios that make you uncomfortable. It means be around people. It is easy to congregate around people who think just like you. To me, that's very boring. People say the same thing you say all the time. It's very, very boring. That's not how life really is. So dare to be uncomfortable. Go to places and engage in conversations. Invite people to settings like these that don't agree with you and challenge. And third and finally, which is very important to me, is commit to living out that which your faith teaches. You know, it's one thing to come together, whether it's on Sunday morning or Friday night or Saturday, whatever it may be, but once you receive that in, what are you committing to live out once you walk away? And I think that's very, very important. And those 3 things to me will allow us to realize that right amongst us, people who look differently than me, but have the same concern. When we hear about a shooting happening in Tallahassee, guess what? Whether you're in an all-white community or all-black community, we're all locking our doors. Because we're all worried about the same exact thing. And so I think that's the overall point is zoning in those realities, but also daring to be uncomfortable.
One thing I just want to challenge all of you to do is just one thing I've noticed, you drive around neighborhoods, no one's on their porches, and it's pretty hot outside, so that might be one reason, right? But neighbors just don't know each other. And we've experienced this recently, maybe more so than other communities in the country, with hurricanes. When we get our power knocked out, forces people to come outside and get to know each other. But I just want to challenge you to go know your neighbors. Like maybe organize something. I know there's a woman who lives on Beard Street that they have all these chairs in their yard. And I drove by them once when I lived over there, and this is great. They were out there drinking and talking. I was like, can I come? And they said, yeah, and I never had time. But I thought that was wonderful. They all got together. They knew when they'd text each other, whatever. And you can use technology, to make that happen. But go meet your neighbors. If you don't know them, like knock on their door, set up a little get-together, just in your yard or your garage, your backyard, just to get to know one another. And it will serve a practical purpose too, and don't bring up Trump and Obama or whatever. Just talk. Find out who each other are and I just want to challenge you that because I think that we are so isolated now. And what I deal with college campuses, people who live on top of each other, who walk around like zombies staring at their phones, who come to me with their anxiety and depression and their loneliness. It's unbelievable. And it's because we're not talking, right? Even my students, they're not talking. So I wanted to try to encourage you with that. One other thing, just to leave you with before we turn to questions, audience, we as churches represent these sort of spheres of influence or community in this community. And if you're not part of a religious congregation, if that's not your thing, but to go out and join one or get involved somehow in this community, whether it's the Carney Center or any of these other charitable organizations out there. A beautiful thing that I experienced, literally this morning, a man I've known for a few years, just got out of prison, came to see me, and he doesn't have anything. And he's living again in a bad area of town, not far from my parish. I'm afraid he's going to get back on crack. But I have people. I have a network of people. I know people. I can find him work. I can probably find him some housing. I can do all that because I'm attached to this broader network, right? So that's going to help this man. If he applied for assistance from the government, I don't know how long that would take or whatever, and the paperwork, but coming to me, I can help him, right, if he wants to help. And the same thing with y'all. We all know people, and we can all help each other. So just encourage you to get involved in things. You have resources maybe you're not even aware of, friends and neighbors and so on, that you can bring to bear on this community that can help maybe end some of the cycle of poverty, that can at least make our community a little bit better and a little bit more friendly. So let's turn it over to questions from the audience. Questions rather than comments, hopefully, but anybody? Right here, thank you. Thanks for being brave.
As you were talking, I was thinking of another Jewish concept, tikkun olam, which is called healing the world. And where does that concept of healing the world come in locally?
I've heard of that concept. In some ways, it's actually a little bit of a later concept. And it's kind of become a catchphrase of especially the Reform movement, which doesn't make it bad. But for me, the tikkun olam, the healing of the world, it's multi-layered, and it comes in on that common good piece. It comes in on the common sense piece. And while I think it's quite silly that we have a debate whether global warming is real or not, just like we have a debate over whether immunization somehow shouldn't be mandatory, that's another issue on some level. But tikkun olam says you use whatever tools you can develop as partners with God to, I would say, make manifest the Garden of Eden or heaven here on earth. Okay? And that's a different theological conception of the hereafter than I think in general the Christian one. But locally, for me, I don't think you can just say locally, don't go and rally for non-plastic straws. That's not tikkun olam. That's a distraction by the corporate entities to get you not to focus on what they're actually doing to our world. But to go and say, even if you do disagree that global warming is true and real, don't you think it's better that we don't just hold up aerosol cans of chemicals and spray it into the air? Because we are caretakers of the earth. We're not dominators. That's a mistranslation of the text. We were not supposed to dominate the earth. We are caretakers of the earth. And we are renters on this earth. God owns the land. And that's the rabbinic idea behind mandatory providing of basic, vital sustenance to the poor, is that everyone deserves to benefit from God's earth, not just the privileged and the wealthy. And by the way, Judaism also says accruing wealth is not a bad thing. But you have to provide for all. So tikkun olam is a soulful thing. It's a practical thing. Everybody should have health insurance. Everybody. And there shouldn't be an intermediary corporate organization. That's not subsidiarity. Smaller government, get the government out? Well, not if you're just putting a corporate entity in. You've just traded your Haman, your whatever, your Amalek. Bible, Amalek, Haman, Purim, Esther. All right, we're there? All right, cool.
I'm guessing this isn't just referring to environmentalism, like heal the world. Is it like more than, is that what it's about, or?
Well, it's not just environmentalism, it's everything. You tikkun, you heal. Yeah, it is. Although Jewish law, mind you, has different categories that prescribe much more. Tikkun olam has become this big umbrella that kind of captures everything. But if we're really going to address problems, you have to get into the nitty-gritty. Because otherwise, that's where some of that, getting people together to talk about the world in general is not necessarily always so helpful, because it's like a merry-go-round that just keeps spinning and spinning. But Jewish law and Judaism, I think, provides the specifics. And you can point to it, and it's very much this worldly based. Right? Go back to the planting of the tree. Who cares if the Messiah is going? It's irrelevant. If the Messiah is coming, it's irrelevant to my life today, right now. And I'm pretty sure the Messiah is not coming in 18 years, so my children are going to inherit this earth from God that I have been renting.
So only real quick, I mean, there's a great document that Pope Francis put out some years ago called Laudato Si. And it's about the environment, and I think everyone in this room would be extremely challenged by it if you're an American. And I'll give you just one example. Everyone here, generally, at least by the way we act, feel entitled to have a room temperature at a comfortable, what we consider comfortable. For some, that's a little bit different, give or take 5 or 6 degrees, but pretty much everywhere I go, they keep the place around 75, 72, something like that. It's a very big challenge. Like, the rest of this world is sweating or cold, and we are burning up resources and energy doing that, and it's almost like outrageous. If we came in here and Gary didn't have AC running, we'd all probably leave, right? We'd feel offended almost, like, don't you care about us or whatever. So it cuts right to, I was very challenged by it in some of my assumptions. I go out to eat, or I go to go, and I get plastic and styrofoam and bags that holds that in. All of the resources that I use, and I don't even think twice about it. That doesn't even occur to me. Right? You go to the subway, they wrap it up in paper, they stick it in another bag. I mean, that's all resources that we use. And we don't even think about it twice as Americans. We just use and use and use and use. So that's one example, I think, how we as a church are trying to be focused on some of these things. Any other questions? Yes, ma'am. What do I think God thinks of homelessness? I can't imagine he's thrilled about it.
What do you think?
God works to give us a place. I mean, we see God described throughout Scripture as the one who is our shelter, who is our refuge. Physical shelter is a reflection of that, meets a basic need of security, meets a basic need of comfort, just meets a basic need for all those who are made in the image of God to have a sense of place. And so certainly from a Christian perspective, I'm looking at the Scriptures, homelessness is wrong. I mean, that's one of the things that we ought to be doing as followers of Christ, is helping people in those circumstances. You even think about the principle of hospitality. What does hospitality mean? It means not just welcoming in those that you know and that you love, but welcoming in even the stranger, and welcoming in those who need a place. And so certainly that's something that we should be working to help with, and we should be partnering, we should be looking to improve community resources, but we can't just leave that off on the government and community resources. That's something that we're called to do.
So, if you believe God has a heart, then I think we have to believe that God has a heart that's broken. Think about homelessness. You think about in our community or any community, here's what you have a surplus of. You have a surplus of liquor stores, but a surplus of churches. Where I pastor on Woodville Highway, which is just past the fairgrounds, from my church to Oak Ridge Elementary School, which is 3 blocks from my church, there are over 13 Christian churches. Various sizes, mind you, but 13. All right? Across the street from Oak Ridge is a government-subsidized apartment complex called Briarwood. Most of the kids that go to Oak Ridge Elementary School are on free or subsidized lunch. They're struggling kids who come to school with 2 t-shirts on, the outer t-shirt shirt of their jacket in the cold weather. That is factual. Some of you may have read the op-ed I did in the paper. I point that out because there are kids who go to school every day hungry, and their meal is what they get at school. That is a reality. But guess what, ladies and gentlemen? That's not the government's responsibility. The churches, there's 13 of them that bring in an offering every Sunday that can be of more help. It only becomes the church's concern when there's somebody inside that congregation that's going through that situation. There's no way. My motto to our church is we are a local church serving the local community through the gospel of Jesus Christ. And what does that mean? I don't want to be in a community as a pastor with a church and I am ignorant or nonchalant to the needs of the community around my church. I bring up Oak Ridge to you because that school is near our church. But I also believe that Christ has a heart. There are examples in the scriptures, use the Samaritan woman and anything else, where he was discouraged against and he engaged in. My overall point is as a professed Christian, I cannot say I desire to be Christ-like and in turn a deaf ear or just a blind eye to the things that would have grieved him. And there are individuals downtown in Tallahassee who are impoverished, who are struggling for mental health, whatever it may be. But usually what happens is we speed walk past them when we see them coming. And I'm not in a general sense. But the fact of the matter is I don't think God's really impressed by our big buildings. I think he's more concerned about what are we doing in our service to each other. What are we doing to those individuals in that regard? You mentioned about being renters. We're stewards. We are literally being entrusted to care for things that don't belong to us. And so homelessness is a great thing. And I will also tell you that in Tallahassee, you look at the Alice population and below, as you guys know me, and either way, I'm going to get a plug in here. But if you look at the community of Tallahassee, many people are struggling with basic needs. What that basically means is they're one unforeseen circumstance away from being on the street. So they may not be the person out there right now, but they're trying to make things stretch out. And I think in that regard, that from my church where I pastor, I tell them I'm less impressed by the car you drive, the title you bear, and who you think you know. I am less impressed about that. I'm more concerned about what are you doing as an act of service to advance the message. I mentioned one of my things is living out that which you believe in. Being in constant activity in that regard, I think is very important. And so I think homelessness, greed, mental health is a major issue that we see what's going on. I think another thing that grieves me is anyone who serves our country in the military and comes back home and we completely ignore their service. Forget about Republican or Democrat. To me, is blatant disrespect, and it's heartbreaking in that regard. Talk about the land of freedom, home of the brave. Somebody died for us to be able to have that freedom, and I think it's very important of us. But it's easy for me to blame government for that. But I wrote this down. Local is us in this room. It's not them on television. I can blame them on television. They're not doing anything. What am I doing? What am I doing in my community? As Father Tim mentioned, do I even know my neighbors? My grandparents knew all of their neighbors. They knew that you were such a grandchild. You shouldn't be acting that way. Now I know my neighbors. We're buying homes, putting up major fences, and keep the person next door from even looking into my yard. And when you have that mindset, we actually are contributing to the same thing we complain about.
So I don't think the two are mutually exclusive. Go local, know your neighbors. But I do think there's an obligation, and as partners with God in the ongoing creation, I consider it a holy affront to our gracious mother. She is wonderful. And so therefore, there is no reason why there should be anybody homeless. We have an obligation, all of us, not just locally here in Tallahassee, but all of us. And I believe that government can serve as that intermediary to help make that happen, because the cost of all of these social services, providing a home for every single person who is homeless, if you tabulated up all the costs, it would cost less to provide a home than it would to provide everything else that you have to when someone does not have a home. So it would cost us less as a society to give a home to every single person who is homeless. It would cost us less overall to provide basic, good health insurance to every single person. When we do not do these things, it's not big government versus small government. We are committing an offense against the common good of our fellow beings created in the image of God. On top of that, the economic arguments against doing these things, it's a facade. It's complete nonsense. The difference is you're looking at one budgetary year versus 30 years and the life of human beings. And so if we want to truly honor life and the sanctity of life, then we would be housing every homeless person, providing health insurance for every single human being, honoring our military service people when they come home, honoring our wonderful role models and heroes who take a knee on the football field because they have gotten a raw deal by this country. And so their act of patriotism, by taking a knee, should be honored as well. And I believe when we say that that person is somehow unpatriotic, we are committing a sin against holiness. Call that a sin against God if you'd like. I'll call it a sin against holiness. So I think if you're going to claim spiritual arguments for policy, then you better make sure the policy and the economics of it actually adds up. And by the way, when you can go and spend more than you need, we could win wars on 7 fronts all at once today. So if we can go spend trillions of dollars on military, we should be able to spend trillions of dollars on human life. And sanctity of life doesn't end when someone is born.
Any other questions? Let's try to squeeze these two in. We'll get both of them, hopefully.
So, part of my day every day is thinking about the burden that is given, if you will, to nonprofits in the community to help people, save people, and to do that for the most vulnerable. I've been on the board of Elder Care Services, who does Meals on Wheels and other great stuff in the community. But I see increasingly the money that comes to organizations like Elder Care Services through grants from the federal government largely. It's getting tighter and tighter and tighter, and the requests to serve are getting greater and greater. And I'm also a lawyer, and I'm concerned because I feel real strongly about not mixing religion and government, but I see the churches and synagogues and every religious organization in the community as a possibility to advocate to our governments, whether they're local governments or federal government, to do exactly what the rabbi just suggested, that there's this money, and all budgets are just an issue of how do we spend money and how should we spend money, and I wish there could be this synergy between nonprofits in the community who are trying to serve people and the church communities and again, the synagogues and every other religious organization to make the case for how money should be allocated and spent. And I just wondered if you all had any thoughts on how can the churches and synagogues be more vocal, maybe, with that kind of an effort.
So I'll be quick with mine. I think I agree with you. I think the challenge you have in some local congregations is we have allowed government to dictate what we say and when we say it. Whenever you're receiving money from government, they now feel like they can control what you say and when you say it. And I think that is completely against that which we talk about. We talked about this years ago. Rabbi mentioned it earlier about, if we're starting from our faith traditions, and that becomes what governs us versus our political ideologies, it's a different conversation. I would also add to the back end of that, though, that the church, as a Christian church, the church has to get back to a point of having a spine. Get back to a point of having a voice again and not being waiting on somebody to give it to us, but we take it and we use it. I think that's very, very important. As a believer of Christ, if you follow his life, he went against the system many times for the good of every man. I think now what happens is we wait our turn in line to be told when we can say something. And the problem is, from a pastoral standpoint, I'm sitting in the room counseling people and families who are struggling. I know their plight. Government's not going to help them out. I go to some of our local commission meetings, and they spend more time arguing about commas and periods and do more on certificates than they do about livelihood. So since I know that and I see that, then I have less expectation on them and more on what do we need to be doing in our regard. Again, if from my church standpoint, we're doing an exercise now looking at of the amount of money we bring in per month. From a percentage standpoint, how much is going toward missions? How much is going toward this? How much is going toward this? And I'll be very honest with you publicly and say, I'm very ashamed of what I saw. Is that we talk good about it, but where your money goes speaks to the heart of your church. And we have a lot of work to be doing in that regard, but we have to get back to a point of openly speaking truth to power and saying what needs to be said, and then holding people accountable. The thing I've done in my church that upset a lot of people locally, personally don't care, I stopped letting local officials come to my church and speak. Here is why. They come during election season, get people riled up what they're going to do. Once they win, I don't see them again. And now I'm held accountable to my members of saying, when you brought them in here, they've made a lot of promises, we don't see it. I think that's an embarrassment to democracy, but it's also an insult to parishioners who have dire needs each and every day. And so from the church standpoint, we got to get back to a point of where we matter. If you look at the civil rights movement, the black church mattered in Martin Luther King's fight. They were vocal. They knew water hoses were coming. They didn't care. Because the better good was, we're thinking about generations beyond us. And our challenge is, if it's always about me, then my children have no chance whatsoever.
Thanks, Derek. Is it quick? What do you think? Probably not. We'll do your question in one answer. Does that sound good?
Well, I guess my question kind of goes with that. If we are putting religion and government together and we should be helping people, then we shouldn't be saying, well, then you need to believe in Jesus Christ or we can't help you, or you need to believe in Judaism or we can't help you, right? So I'm a social worker in this town, and I've seen it happen where if you are being helped, it is that you have to accept that, right? You have to accept the religion to be helped. And so my question is, if we're taking that out, because we all believe different things in this room, are we really helping people in this community or in our world if they don't believe what we believe?
I think, for one, at least if I can speak for myself, at least in our church, Mother Teresa wasn't making a lot of converts in Calcutta. She was taking care of people whether or not, it didn't matter. And some people did become Christians or Catholics after, but most probably did not. In our church, we have St. Vincent de Paul Society. People come in all the time, they're not Catholic, they don't go to our church, but we help them as much as we can. So I don't know, I've never heard of, at least in my experience as a Catholic, of churches saying, well, you can only get help from us if you're Catholic or Christian. That just hasn't been my experience in our church. Maybe it is in others, but not in mine.
Well, and I'll speak to that a little bit. As followers of Christ, we are called to love and help all others who are created in the image of God. And at the same time, we're to do that in Jesus' name. We offer a cup of cold water in Jesus' name. We're to do that as a witness to our faith. We are called to call upon people to believe, but that ought never to be a condition for whether we are going to love our neighbor, serve our neighbor, reach out to our neighbor. I mean, ultimately, we do that as Christians, as followers of Jesus Christ, as worship unto Him, however it's received. But we're so called to love and serve and give and make a difference, regardless of whether people join with it. We hope that they do. We want them to. We'll call upon them to do that. But that can't ever be a condition of whether we will love, serve, give, help.
So just to speak to this a little bit, in the Jewish concept, there's tzedakah, which is an answer, but those funds that were set up by those Jewish communities, especially as we started to, not fear for our lives when we ventured out of our little shuttles in Eastern Europe and even in the United States in time, they were used for anybody who came. They were required, they could be used for anybody who came. The other piece, I think when we talk about the Reform movement of Judaism believes very much in the separation of church and state. And I think in general, Jews are very kind of perplexed when people say there's kind of like a war in Christianity, or there's somehow the United States has become inhospitable to faith or to Christians. And frankly, there should be a separation of church and state, right? I had friends of mine, acquaintances of mine in South Carolina trying to adopt a child, thought they'd found a match, place was getting government support, but because it was a faith-based place, they could not adopt a child. Now, I'm fully okay with a Christian adoption agency that's private and only finds placement for children in Christian homes if they don't receive government support. But this country was not founded on Christianity. Judeo-Christian values are not Judeo. That's a false, please don't use that word anymore. There are no Judeo-Christian values. We come from our own beautiful particularity. But if we're talking about separation of church and state, it has to be across the way. And this is why I disagreed when, members of the military, before taking a test, were required to say a prayer to Jesus before they took the test. It's why I wrote an op-ed when George W. Bush said, "I don't understand how anyone could be president and not be a Christian." That was wrong. He should have resigned if he really felt that way. And I would say the same thing about a president who's a Democrat. And so I think we have to be careful about the separation of church and state, because it means, depending on what window you're looking through, it's a very different perspective. I think some of my Muslim brothers and sisters would probably have the same perplexing thought around this time or a couple months, the war on Christmas comes up again. And I know that's not all Christians, I get that. But I've heard it enough in common parlance when we've been wrapping stuff at Christmas time at Barnes & Noble, because none of the other groups will do it, but we Jews are there to help people wrap their Christmas gifts. But you hear it when people walk by. And generally, if you hear something when people are walking by, it means it's not just an outlier. It means that people really believe this, that there's a war on Christianity in this country, which is just not true. There's different ideas in the common marketplace, and people who say, if George Washington wrote my people, a Jewish congregation, a letter saying, this is your home, then this country should honor that and shouldn't impose one's Christian faith or any faith on anybody else. Hence, I can go and lobby my Congress people from a Jewish perspective. But if I run for Congress and I start imposing my religion on other people, then I should resign from Congress.
So that's going to be a great segue into talking about values one day, where values come from. I wish you'd been there we talked about it a little bit last year. But Fred, thank you so much. It's so great to have our new guest, our new rabbi, our new panelist here, so thank you. And thank you for coming. I don't know offhand what's next month, but look it up on your internet, on your Facebook, or whatever.
And we're at Temple Israel.
We're at Temple Israel?
On October something, second half of the month.
Thank you all very much. Have a great day.